Hello and welcome back to MIDI Sequencing Tips from Tom. Today we're going to take a brief look at the fundamentals of analog synthesis, and then I'm going to walk you through a software emulation of an analog synthesizer. For this tutorial, I chose the Tyrell N6. Tyrell N6 is an excellent software synthesizer developed by the German online magazine Amazona.de, and it is totally free. Totally free. Also, I love the irony of working on music to Bladerunner on a synthesizer named after the Nexus 6 replicant manufactured by the Tyrell Corporation. Tyrell N6 is available from the website below, and it supports audio units, VST2, and Digidesign AAX. Before we get started today, I had a student ask me, Tom, what are those synthesizers in the rack behind you that we see every day? So I thought I'd take you a brief tour. This is the Yamaha TX816. It is essentially 8 DX7s in a box, so obviously FM synthesis. This is the Roland D110. It was an early digital synthesizer, and its successor, the Roland U220. Next is the TX81Z. This was a 4-operator FM synthesizer. The next one down is the Proteus World. This was a sample playback 16-channel multi-timbral that featured world instruments. This is my classic Roland Super JX, actual analog synthesizer, and the PG800 programmer that goes with that. And at the very bottom is the Proteus One. This was the original Proteus 16-channel multi-timbral sample playback instrument. And this also has an additional card in it that gave me additional samples. An oscillator is an electrical device that produces an electrical signal or waveform that can be amplified and sent to an audio output. Oscillators themselves have been around for 100 years. However, Moog, Buchla, and the early synthesizer pioneers created an oscillator with a voltage-controlled input. Changing the amount of control voltage into a VCO changes the pitch. If we were to hook up a keyboard to the control voltage input, we have now made the first step in creating a performance synthesizer. Subtractive synthesizers traditionally routed the oscillator to a filter. Filter is a device that removes part of the audio spectrum. Filters are defined by what part of the spectrum they remove. A low-pass filter removes the upper spectrum above the cutoff frequency. Filters in synthesizers have an audio input, an audio output, and a control voltage input. Changing the amount of control voltage into a voltage-controlled filter changes the cutoff frequency of the filter, making the sound brighter or duller. Subtractive synthesizers traditionally routed the filter to an amplifier. An amplifier is a device that makes the audio signal louder. Amplifiers in synthesizers have an audio input, an audio output, and, again, a control voltage input. Changing the amount of control voltage into a voltage-controlled amplifier changes the amplitude or volume of a signal. The final piece of the synthesis puzzle was to make the amplifier respond to hitting a key on the keyboard. Analog synthesis accomplished this with an envelope generator. Striking a key on the keyboard would generate a control voltage and a signal known as a gate, and often an additional trigger signal. This signal would make the envelope generator start to generate its control voltages. Early synthesizers typically had a 4-stage envelope generator, generating attack, or the time it takes to reach the loudest point, decay, the time needed to reach the sustain level, a sustain level maintained as long as the key was down, and release, the amount of time needed to return to silence. Synthesizers also had devices known as modulators, the most common one being a low-frequency oscillator, or LFO. If the LFO was patched into the control voltage input of an oscillator, it would modulate the pitch. If an LFO was patched into the control voltage input of a filter, it would modulate the cutoff frequency and therefore change the timbre. If an LFO was patched into the control voltage input of an amplifier, it would modulate the volume. Vangelis is a composer, born in Greece in 1943, and best known for his Chariots of Fire and Bladerunner film scores. Many of the sounds for Bladerunner came from the Yamaha CS80, one of the first polyphonic analog synths to be commercially available. Vangelis was introduced to the CS80 at a trade fair in 1977 and was tremendously excited by the possibilities. He arranged to have one on loan for a few weeks while deciding whether to spend the 4,800 pounds necessary to buy it. Shortly after, he imported a CS80 from Japan in order to bypass the 6-month UK waiting list, and the synth arrived in London after a mammoth train journey through Russia. Arturia makes a spectacular software emulation of the CS80, and I use it frequently. However, for this demonstration, I wanted to use an analog synthesizer emulation that was free to download. This is the Tyrell N6. The Tyrell N6 is an analog synthesis emulation. It's a 2-oscillator. We have a first oscillator. It's pulse wave, sawtooth wave, and a triangle wave close to a sine wave. We have a second oscillator. Also with a choice of waveforms. The Tyrell also has a sub-oscillator, which is essentially oscillator 1 with the sawtooth wave down an octave. The Tyrell also supports oscillator sync. Oscillator sync ties the second oscillator to the frequency of the first one. So changing the tuning will not change tuning, but actually will change the timbre. The oscillators in Tyrell are hardwired into the filter. So this is a low-pass filter, and we are modulating the cutoff frequency here. The Tyrell also supports resonance, which amplifies the cutoff frequency. The filter in the Tyrell actually has a low pass and a high pass filter. The balance between them is set by this MIX SPR. All the way up being the high-pass filter, all the way down being the low-pass filter. That can also be switched to a band-pass filter. VCF pole actually adjusts the slope beyond the cutoff frequency. 12 dB per octave, 24 or 36. Key follow ties the output of the keyboard to the filter, so as you go up the keyboard, the notes will get brighter. The Tyrell has 2 LFOs. LFO 1, hardwired to vibrato. LFO 1 can also be patched into the filter. In essence, we're taking the control voltage output of the LFO and patching it into the control voltage input of the filter. We can also patch in the second envelope generator. Or we could patch in both of them. Now, the LFO has a series of waveforms: triangle, saw, square wave. We also have random. Random actually takes a sample and hold of a noise source. Creating this classic kind of sound. Now we could also patch it into our filter. In essence, we're taking the control voltage of LFO and patching it into the oscillator and the filter. Okay, in addition to the LFOs, we have a noise generator. The noise knob over here goes from white noise to pink noise, all the way over to what we would call red noise or brownish noise. The Tyrell also has a ring modulator. A ring modulator inputs two frequencies and outputs the difference and the sum of them. So in this case, we have oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And as we change the tuning, the Tyrell also has a series of LFOs. LFO is a low frequency oscillator. LFO 1. LFO 1 is hardwired to vibrato. The LFO also has a series of waveforms, sawtooth. And it also has the classic random. This takes a sample and hold of a noise input. We could also patch this into our filter. The LFO also has a series of start functions. If I play sync, All the LFOs on every note will run identically. However, I've hit gate, each one will run starting when you hit the note. Now, rate mod will adjust the intensity and the polarity. And depth mod works kind of counterintuitively. In essence, it eliminates the intensity. Maximum intensity will be all the way to the left. The envelope generators. Envelope generator 1 is tied to the VCA. Changing the attack time. Changing the release time. The velocity knob will tie the envelope attack to velocity. Higher MIDI velocities will shorten the attack time. Key track ties the envelope release to velocity. And fall rise actually gives you a fifth stage. It will take the sustain level and bring it back up. In essence, giving you a fifth stage. And last but not least, there's a matrix. The matrix, the first part of the matrix, actually will modify oscillator 1 by oscillator 2. In essence, creating FM or frequency modulation synthesis. Frequency modulation synthesis can create timbral changes by modifying one oscillator with another. And last but not least, you can tie virtually any parameter, in this case mod wheel, to virtually any parameter here. So I'm going to take my mod wheel, tie it into my filter. And then on the output, we have a classic chorus. With the depth and mix controls. And this will actually create a stereo image. I'll play you the Bladerunner cue and then demonstrate how I created several of the patches on a freeware synthesizer. I'm going to demonstrate some classic synthesizer sounds that were created with analog synthesis. The first one is the sequence bass. We're going to select a track here. I have assigned the Tyrell N6 to this track. We're queued up at the very beginning, and this track is in record. Now, to create this sound, we need to create a blank MIDI region. I'm going to option click here, create empty MIDI region. I'm going to create a region here in my sequence bass track at the very beginning. The track is record enabled, and we are queued up at the beginning of the sequence. Now, I'm going to open the piano roll editing window. The piano roll allows you to see notes graphically as blocks. I'm going to open up the step import keyboard, and we'll see this. Step record allows us to enter notes in non-real time, and they will be entered in the rhythmic value that you select here. So I'm going to select 16th notes, and I'm going to go up here and select record MIDI input. Now you notice as I hit notes, they are entered into the sequence. You also notice that they are velocity sensitive. All right, so I have step recorded these values. I go back and play them. Let's open up Tyrell. Now you notice Tyrell ADSR2, the envelope generator 2, is tied into the filter. The mod value is turned up, and down here, envelope 2 is tied to velocity. So as I hit the key harder, it's going to trigger envelope 2 harder, and it's going to trigger the filter harder. You'll notice if I were to put this in mono and assign all 8 voices, I'll create a much bigger, fatter sound. The second classic synth sound I'm going to call the Taurus Bass. The Moog Taurus was a foot-operated analog synthesizer designed by Moog and originally manufactured from 1975 to 1981. Instead of a conventional keyboard, it used an organ-style pedal board because it was intended to be played by foot while the player's hands played the keyboards. The Taurus was monophonic, had a distorted sawtooth wave generated by 2 oscillators running through a 24 dB resonant low-pass filter with key tracking and a 1 3-stage voltage-controlled amplifier. This was the classic bass sound of the prog rock era. So let's start with a basic bass sound. I have 2 oscillators and my low-pass filter. First thing I want to do is take all 8 voices and slam them on each note. You notice the depth come up immediately. And we're going to add just a touch of detune between the 2 oscillators. Let them beat a little bit against each other. Alright, we're going to adjust the attack time. Bring the sustain down a little bit. Some decay. And a little bit of release. Now we want to add a little touch of envelope to the filter. So let's bring up our attack time. We now have ADSR, envelope generator 2, assigned to the filter. The whole thing about the Taurus Bass is it had to happen slowly. Now, we could add just a little touch of vibrato to that. And we're going to delay the vibrato so it doesn't come immediately. Just got a little touch of that. Classic Moog bass, the Taurus. This third classic analog patch is one that I call the Vangelis Horn. We're going to start with 2 oscillators, slightly detuned. My filter's pretty much wide open. We're going to add just a touch of the second envelope generator to the filter. And we can add more voices. Slow down the attack a little bit. Now, what makes this patch work, so let's go over here to our mix window. We're going to wash it in a little bit of a plate reverb. And then we're going to add a stereo delay. I'm going to put about 500 milliseconds on this side, about 600 on this side, and bring our mix up a little bit. So we get that kind of a thing where it's beating against each other. Now, Vangelis did this on the CS80 using his ribbon controller. But in the Tyrell, we can do this with our regular pitch bend. It allows us to set different intervals for the upward pitch bend as opposed to the downward. So this tune is basically in D minor, but it's in a D minor Phrygian. It's in a key of B flat. So the first change from D minor to C minor, I can use this half step. And back down. In the second key change, I'm going from D minor again to C minor, so I have it going down a whole step. So the sound is a combination of the bright horn plus the reverb plus the delay.